Hello, listeners. Just a brief note to avoid confusion. This episode's interview with Jackson Winkeljohn's striking coach Brandon Gibson did take place a few days before Daniel Cormier announced his injury and subsequent withdrawal from the UFC 197 main event against John Jones, so that explains a couple of incongruous mentions of DC's name during the interview. Also, make sure to stay tuned after the interview for our discussion of the surprisingly compelling main event matchup of UFC Zagreb, that being Ben Rothwell versus Junior Dos Santos, and a couple of other intriguing fights from that card. Enjoy the show. I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined once again by Patrick Wyman, and we are both very pleased to be joined by a very special guest, both very excited to talk to this man, the striking coach at Jackson Winkeljohn MMA, the man who works with fellows like John Jones and Carlos Condit on the regular, Brandon Gibson. Brandon, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, thank you, Connor. Thank you, Patrick.
We are very happy to have you here today. And the first thing we wanted to talk about is because you've had such an increasing role at Jackson Winkeljohn in recent years. And recently you did an interview with Luke Thomas, I think was back in December, for his Technique Talk series. And you talked about your sort of individual approach that you take for each fighter. You said you're not trying to teach standard kata. You said I train Overeem very different than I do Condit, Jones, or a guy like John Dodson. I don't look at myself like a set style striking coach. I look at myself as a collaborator. What in your background and philosophy has led to this approach to striking training?
Well, I've been fortunate enough to grow up under Greg Jackson and Mike Winkeljohn. I'm 34 now. I've been training with them since I was very young. I think it's like an artist studio, and we've been able to be exposed and influenced by so many great martial artists from within our dojo, but also from all over the world, and champions of all shapes and sizes and backgrounds. And it's been very influential in my development as a coach to get to interact and work with so many great fighters. And I think through that, I definitely, from a young age, knowing I wanted to coach, took that, almost like a Bruce Lee-esque approach to no style. And, I just try to have that good eye like Greg would do to look at the fighters where we need to continue personal development in one way or another, and or polish the great tools they already have.
So one of the things that really stood out to me in getting to watch you train a whole bunch of guys back in November, and again, thank you for letting me come in and watch you do that, was the emphasis that you put on the space of the cage and realism in training. That when you're working pads, it's a very active kind of pad holding, a very active kind of training. Is this a technique that you started with, or is this something that you've developed over time?
I think I've definitely been working towards developing it more and more and more. The cage is our battleground. I see a lot of schools, a lot of fighters train on, just wide open mats or in boxing rings. And, that's cool for a section of the skill set. But so much of what we do is dependent on the angles of the octagon, which are very unique, the spacing of the cage, which is very unique, and the angles that come along with that. So to me, it's crucial with these higher level guys to always hit in the cage, always train in the cage. And it's pretty rare we hit out like on an open mat or in an open area when it's fight specific period in camp.
So about specific fighters, Brandon, I think you have a lot of, perhaps more than any other gym at Jackson Wink, you have a broad array of different stylists, guys from many different backgrounds with many different strengths and across a ton of different weight divisions. And so I'm interested to know if you could give us any specific examples of like specific trademark techniques maybe that you've worked on with certain fighters. Like, for example, Andrei Arlovsky has always been a very right-hand dependent guy. He's got a very heavy right hand, and then since working with you, he kind of debuted that back fist to make up for the left hook that he hasn't always thrown too much in the Travis Brown fight. Carlos Condit's been throwing a lot more elbows, kind of bridging that gap between long range and clinch range, because he's always been comfortable marching into the pocket with those punch-kick combinations. What are some specific ways that you try to advance these fighters that suit their strengths?
Some of the fights I guess, maybe more proud of are, some of the ones where we really did focus on a certain technique or strategy all camp, and then it played out exactly like we had planned from day one of camp. And I think one of those fights I'm very proud of is Tim Kennedy versus Rafael Natal. Natal liked to circle, and Tim was always known for his grappling prowess, but not really known as being a striker. And I thought we could pressure Natal up against the fence, get him to exits with a lack of defense like he had shown in the past. And Tim was able to kind of use his level change to set up that monstrous hook that sealed the fight for us.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, I can't take any credit for this. There's things I rep a lot with the guys, but it's definitely in collaboration with Mike Winkeljohn, who's my mentor and coach as well. But we really do put our heads together, and we almost take on certain roles through camp where he'll be very focused on one aspect and I'll be on a different one. I think the Gustafson fight with Jones is another good example. Wink worked a lot of the big head kicks that John landed, and I worked a lot on the spinning technique and uppercuts that also landed a lot throughout that fight for us and kind of saved our butt at times.
Mm-hmm.
So when you get to working with a new fighter, so I saw you working a lot with Magomed Mustafayev when I was there watching. How do you approach a new guy? Let's say you get a new fighter coming in. This is going to be somebody that you're working with. How do you evaluate that fighter, and then how do you plan your sessions around that particular fighter's strengths and around what you're going to be doing for particular opponents?
Yeah, it's definitely a feel-out process. We get to watch their style a lot in sparring and in the drill classes and try to pick up a little bit of, their preferred strikes and range and defensive habits. And then, I always like to feel them out a lot on the mitts before we do anything crazy on pads. I always just like to get a good assessment of their basics, of their ability to transfer power, of their ability to utilize their core through strikes, their ability to maintain footwork and range, and assess their defense. So the first couple sessions are always a little bit of a feel out. And then once we kind of have that assessment of, all right, here's where they're really good, here's where we need to polish up, then we bring in that strategic side for their upcoming fight and really look at, all right, well, how can we use their strengths to dictate this fight and take it where we want to go, and what are the tools that we're going to need to seal the deal, and, what defensive tools we need to sharpen up as well. So it's always this evolving process. But yeah, with a guy like John Dotson, who I've worked with for several years, I feel like we know that all the time, but we're still going back and assessing whether, it's looking at that last fight against Demetrius Johnson and looking at where we, could tighten things up and improve on, to just, regular sparring and seeing what kind of looks are giving him trouble or what areas he's really excelling in. So this is always evolving, evaluating process.
Now, speaking of, you talk about progressing continually with one fighter, developing your relationship, but you have also spoken in the past about progressing MMA striking. And in fact, when you talked to Luke Thomas for his Technique Talk interview, you kind of mentioned that you feel like you're at least trying to be on the cutting edge of MMA striking right now. And so one thing that you mentioned that really stood out to me was the sort of the fading prevalence of classic Muay Thai and Dutch kickboxing. You kind of seem to feel like they're being left in the dust to a certain extent. Is there a way you could elaborate on that stance?
Yeah, I definitely took a lot of heat for saying that, but I would apply that towards a variety of other different kind of the standard classic martial arts as well. I'm not saying that one aspect of them is bad. I think there's just areas and ranges that are more applicable in certain areas than others. But as far as coming in with that as like a standard skill set where you don't work boxing, you don't have any karate, you don't have any transitional striking, it's going to keep a fighter very limited. And that would be the same if they were a boxer or if they came from an American kickboxing background or a taekwondo background. Like, too many of these guys are getting to a higher level without the supplemental blended striking methods. And I'm sure they can make it to the UFC and have some success in their career. But I think you look at all the high-level guys that are ranked and contenders, and none of them have just one skill set, you know, whether it's from the wrestling side or we could look at it from a jiu-jitsu standpoint. Like, you can't come in just with one basis of jiu-jitsu or one basis of wrestling.
Right.
All these guys have to continuously evolve and have, you know, Greco-style, freestyle wrestling, a folk-style wrestling, judo style, and then really start blending in their takedowns. And it's the same for striking.
So that's a really interesting point. It seems like, kind of regardless of the base skill set that we're seeing fighters come from, there's a real resurgence of outside fighting, of kind of stick and move type of striking. What do you think is driving that kind of trend?
I think the defense is really starting to evolve at the higher levels of MMA. You know, I think early on we had a lot of brawlers where you had a lack of defensive awareness or positional awareness. And now as that's getting cleaned up and tuned up with all of these fighters, it's taking more and more striking prowess to exploit those defensive weaknesses. And one of the best areas I can see that is through blended mixed martial arts, obviously, like faking takedowns to strikes, faking strikes to takedowns, and getting these guys in the positions that they need to be to, you know, dictate the pace of the fight.
You talk about blending striking with takedowns and blending different martial arts. Do you still think of separate phases, separate ranges, separate styles, or do you make a concerted effort to just sort of think of it as fighting and keep your mind open to all the options that are available?
No, it's definitely a balance for as much as I love, you know, like Carlos Condit throwing, you know, spectacular elbows against Thiago Alves. Mm-hmm. You know, I also want Carlos to be able to throw 5,000 jabs, 10,000 jabs throughout a camp. So it's always this balance of working the classics, working the transitions, working the ranges. And there's times we do just a straight up boxing class where we really are trying to improve the finite details of their boxing style for MMA. And then there's other times where, you know, it's a very complex workout where they're looking for takedowns, they're using the cage, they're using slick defense, they're, you know, we're addressing every single part of it.
So speaking of boxing, and just to hit on a video you just posted of yourself working pads with John Jones last night, in what ways do you think that he's evolved over the years? It seems like, I mean, boxing is the clearest one. He's a much, much cleaner boxer in general than he used to be. But how do you think he's evolved?
You know, even despite some of his recent troubles, I think John's continuing to evolve just as through his mental strength and fortitude. You know, that more so than any one martial arts segment. He's becoming mentally stronger. I think John may have the highest fight IQ out of anybody I've ever trained. He can see patterns, set patterns, disrupt patterns, and he can fight in all ranges. But, you know, I definitely am proud of the progression he's made with his hands. I think his kicks are becoming stronger as well, you know, and he's always working his wrestling with Coach Israel Martinez. And he's been really focused on a lot of grappling this camp with Professor Roberto Alcantara, we all call him Tusa. But I think that just shows that mental strength that I'm talking about, that John's always progressing as a martial artist. Watching tape with John's an amazing thing. You know, he sees things that sometimes us coaches don't see right away, and he has a very good understanding of it all. But not just that, he's able to apply it.
So Jones versus Cormier 2 is coming up. I guess they're calling it Cormier versus Jones 2 now that Cormier is holding the belt.
Rightfully so.
Yeah. Can you?
We're embracing the blue corner.
I saw that you had a post recently on social media that said "and new." You're quite happy to say that you're gunning back for the title.
Yeah, we're very aware of the situation and what's taking place, and Cormier's done a great job defending his belt. He's the champ for sure, but John took his undefeated record the first time, and we're going to take the belt the second time.
Is there any sense in John's mind that you as a team and he as a fighter are coming in as the underdog, or does he still have kind of that championship level confidence?
Oh, he always has a championship level confidence, but we're embracing this blue corner role for sure, and Cormier has his belt, but John knows he's a champion. Very cool. Nobody took it away from him.
So we've got the fight coming up very shortly. Can you give us a general prediction before we move on?
This is John's first rematch. We had kind of 5 rounds a year and a half ago as a blueprint, as a litmus test, and I think we've kind of cracked this formula and added a lot of new things to it, and we're very aware of the evolution that DC has shown in these past 2 fights. And I know he's working hard. I know he's going to bring new tools, but I see John finishing this fight in the 4th round.
Well, we're certainly looking forward to seeing that fight. And just before we wrap up here, had a couple of questions about younger fighters that you're working with. Connor and I are huge fans of Cody Garbrandt, with whom you've put in a lot of work in the recent past. What do you think of Cody as a fighter? Like, how high can he go?
Oh, I think Cody can be a world champion for sure. He has that right mindset. He has that right work ethic. And I know that as the stage continues to get bigger, he'll be more and more prepared for that. He's just he's a young man. He's really starting to come in on his, to his own in the UFC. I'm excited for his fight against Thompson Almeida. I think, those are 2 very, very high level young fighters that are both, on track to become a champion. And, they're going to cross paths here the end of May. And I think Cody's really putting them together. I think it's going to be his time to shine and really get his name out there as a contender, not just a prospect.
That Almeida fight is a hell of a matchup. We just talked about it last week. What is it like to kind of be sharing Cody as a fighter, as a prospect, as a student with Team Alpha Male? Is there any difficulties involved in having him be a sort of a 2-camp fighter at the moment?
No, I wouldn't even say he's a 2-camp fighter. He's definitely Team Alpha Male. We just have a good relationship. I've known him way before he was in the UFC. We've always clicked on pads, and I'm just happy to get to help out in whatever role is needed. But, Uriah and the team over there at Team Alpha Male, they have a great thing going. They've made their own champions in the past, and they're the ones putting in that hard work with Cody every day. And, if he gets to come out to Albuquerque and work with me for a couple of days, that's great. Sometimes I go out to Sacramento and get to put in some work with him and his team. So he's just, a young man I care a lot about as a friend. So I like to help him out where I can. And, we could talk technique all day, but at the end of the day, when it comes down to coaching, it's really about developing those relationships and being a motivator and a guy that can inspire these guys and work with them at all levels and all phases of camp. And that's the day in, day out grind of coaching. And Cody and I definitely have that good relationship where we're always in touch and we're always talking, and I'm excited to see him grow, and I'm excited to see him get his hand raised in May.
Well, Brandon, we're excited to see you continue to work with him. We have really enjoyed seeing all the work that you've done with guys like John Jones and Carlos Condit, among many others. And good luck to you guys in your upcoming fights. We've got John Jones, we've got Cody Garbrandt, we've got Cub Swanson. You're a busy man. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Connor.
Okay, Heavy Hands will be back with the breakdown of the most interesting fights of UFC Zagreb after this break. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And welcome back. Can we give a little bit of appreciation for that discussion with Brandon Gibson, Pat?
That was awesome. I love talking to Brandon. He's a sharp dude, and we look forward to having him back on again after what we now know will be Ovin St. Preux versus John Jones.
Yes, yeah, a little bit of an adjustment since we recorded that interview, but Brandon did agree to come on after Jones's fight to discuss, and I know that John Jones posted an Instagram post the other day of he and Gibson and Izzy Martinez and somebody else all sitting down to review OSP's tape and come up with a new game plan, so we will... even on 3 weeks' notice, we will have some strategy to discuss with him when he returns, and hopefully he is definitely able to, because that will be a blast.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always fascinating to get an idea for what the process is, and those guys are very, very process oriented.
Mm-hmm. Also, it sounds like an amazing party. Like they all just gather at midnight on a Tuesday night to just watch a bunch of OSP fights in preparation. I'd love to be part of that team. I would love for my job to be staying up late watching fights because it's what I do for free already. It's, I just lie in bed silently watching old footage. So what we're going to discuss for the rest of the episode is the upcoming card, the next upcoming card. We have, after a little bit of a lull in the schedule, we have some really good matchups. This UFC Zagreb is, it's another one of those ones that does not look stellar when you look at it. But once you start to research the matchups, it has a lot of good fights. Surprising number of heavyweight fights. This main card has the most potential to be amazing and or hilarious or terrible and stupid of any other card I can think of, because it's mostly mid-tier heavyweights.
It's going to be all of those things at once. All of those things at once. So we have the great Timothy Johnson. Best known for that barn burner that he put on with Jared Rochold.
I love Timothy Johnson, by the way. I really like Timothy Johnson.
You got some weird-ass taste in fighters that you like. I'm just going to say that, man. Look,
Timothy
weird-ass taste.
Timothy Johnson is not at fault for Jared Rochold having a boring fight. I just want to say that.
Are we going to pretend that Timothy Johnson wasn't also complicit in that? Because he was. He was a part of that.
What's Timothy Johnson, the boxer-wrestler, supposed to do against the two-time NCAA All-American? He took Jared Rochold down twice in that fight and almost knocked him out in the third round. I think he did pretty damn well, considering... I mean, Jared Rochold has a reputation for dull fights. Are we going to start acting like, I don't know, GSP is a shit fighter for having a really awful fight against John Fitch?
I think we got a new tagline for the podcast.
What's that?
Come for the interviews with luminaries of the sport. Stay for the impassioned defense of Timothy Johnson, and I assume also that awful mustache. I
think Timothy Johnson. By the way, I think he's going to be a very difficult debut opponent for Marcin Tybura.
Yeah, it's a stupid matchup.
Yeah,
it's a stupid matchup because Tybura he's basically a unicorn, a legitimate heavyweight prospect.
Yes,
in a division that's gotten almost no meaningful new blood over the last 4 or 5 years. Yep. So what do? We put him up against a Division III wrestler who's enormous, really tough, pretty well-rounded, and is not exactly have a yen for putting on incredibly exciting fights.
When Tibor's weak spots are almost certainly his wrestling and his comfort and exchanges.
Exactly.
Two things that Johnson likes to do.
Yeah, it's when they put that German guy Jarges Donho up against Daniel Omilanchuk. Like, why would you make that fight?
Yeah.
Like, what exactly are you trying to accomplish there?
Yeah, who knows? Speaking of strange matchmaking, one of the other fights we're going to be discussing after we discuss the main event, which is Rothwell Dos Santos, a match that I love. We have Mairbek Taisumov versus Damir Hadzovic. Hadzovic, a genuine prospect. According to our friend and friend of the show, Adel Birkic, he is the fourth fighter from Bosnia to compete in the UFC. Joining fellow Bosnian Mirsad Bektic, and joining teammate at Rumble MMA, Nicolas Dolby, whose fight with Zack Cummings we will also be discussing. But first, we want to get to the main event, the slightly depressing, slightly hilarious, and all-around fascinating heavyweight matchup between unlikely title contender Ben Rothwell and a guy we never expected to be in the position in which he finds himself, Junior Dos Santos.
So before we get into talking about the technical aspects of this matchup, Connor, did you see the selections that I tweeted last night, or that I retweeted last night from friend of the show, By Your Logic on Twitter?
I don't think I did.
Oh my God! So Rothwell has come up with a Star Wars character.
I did see that.
and the best quotation in the history of the world is to be found in that interview. Obviously, my character knows the knowledge of all those things.
Ben Rothwell sits at home between training sessions and dreams up Sith that are super evil because the real Sith Lords in the movies aren't evil enough for him.
Correct.
And he genuinely thinks that this is Ben Rothwell sits there and he's like, why aren't there these like completely black and white super evil characters in the movie? Like, he thinks it's a really good idea.
Yeah. Star Wars, too nuanced for Ben Rothwell.
Yes, basically. There's no better way to say that.
And with all of that under our belts here, let's talk about Ben Rothwell, the fighter, who is actually pretty damn good. He's a good fighter. This is an interesting matchup.
And shockingly about Ben Rothwell, as I think he has a sneaky a pool of fight IQ from which to draw. You would not expect it, having just heard that. But Ben Rothwell is actually pretty good at eyeing his openings and adapting as a fight goes on.
Yeah, absolutely. He's an interesting fighter in that regard, and he's one of these guys. He's got 45 professional fights under his belt, plus God knows how many kickboxing matches he had before that, because I'm pretty sure he was a kickboxer too. He's got a ton of experience to draw on, and he's a good adaptive fighter. He's got a broad base of skills. He's got a lot of tools in his arsenal on the feet. He does a lot of different things, and that makes him a really tricky matchup for what you might consider a more classically trained striker in Junior Dos Santos.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the one thing, okay, so there's basically a lot of different outcomes that could happen in this fight. In order to kind of frame them properly in the discussion, why don't you and I just take two sides, since I think we are going to end up picking opposite opponents, though neither of us, I'm sure, feels very confident in the pick because it's such a confounding matchup. I'm going to argue for Ben Rothwell, what I think are his strengths in this matchup, and you argue for Junior Dos Santos. Does that work for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so I think the one thing that really, really stands in Ben Rothwell's favor, two things, I will say, that really stand in his favor, and there are a few other small little nodes, as Greg Jackson might say, are his durability, of course. He's durable by heavyweight standards, even by heavyweight standards, and he is huge and strong. So I think that massive size and strength is going to kind of close the gap for him between the skill level between him and Cain Velasquez, right? So Cain Velasquez could hold Junior Dos Santos up against the fence because he's an amazing wrestler and has a great understanding of positioning, and Ben Rothwell doesn't have that, but he has a lot more size, and basically all of the recent matchups we have seen of Ben Rothwell in the clinch, he has effortlessly dealt with his opponents. Josh Barnett, there was a strange... Do you recall in that Josh Barnett fight when Barnett's corner was telling him that Rothwell was scared of the clinch and that Josh could basically have fun there?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about... So in his last... on this, 4-fight winning streak that Rothwell's on right now, he has fought two of the greatest heavyweight clinch fighters of all time in Alistair Overeem and Josh Barnett, and he has effortlessly shucked both of them off whenever he desired. Yeah,
granted this is medium ream, not uber ream. But Alistair Overeem has still never struggled to apply his tools in the clinch, at least until he gets exhausted. And he tried to clinch a few times with Ben Rothwell, and Ben Rothwell just kind of shoved him away. And in the fight with Josh Barnett, I don't know what Barnett's corner was seeing, but Rothwell was easily pushing. I think they thought he was frightened because he was pushing Barnett away, but it was the ease with which he was doing it that stood out to me. And then when he did want to clinch with Rothwell in the second round, he did it on his terms, and he had great success there and ended up setting up the fight-ending choke. So I think that amount of size, combined with Junior's well-understood propensity for backing himself into the fence, is going to be a really difficult specific stylistic matchup for Junior to overcome.
Okay, so I'll come up with my counterpoints to that. I would say, first and foremost, that it's not so much that Junior backs himself into the fence as if you make a good concerted effort to back Junior into the fence, you can make that happen. Yep. The reason why I don't think that Rothwell is going to do that, not that he is unable to do that, but that he's not going to do that, is because Rothwell's pressure tends to come in bursts.
Yes.
It's not a consistent flowing pressure game where he backs you up to the fence, he gets his shots off, he gets back into the center of the cage, and then he immediately starts to pressure you again.
He's kind of a boxer puncher in a weird way.
Yeah, or an aggressive counter fighter. Alternatively, I think that Rothwell is not a pressure fighter so much as he likes to be moving forward.
Yeah,
and I think it's important to make the distinction between those two.
He likes
things.
to be forcing reactions, but he doesn't necessarily like to be swarming or shoving you backwards at all times.
Exactly. And I think that in the context of this matchup, Junior Dos Santos is a fighter who kind of tacitly needs for you to agree to fight him in his kind of fight, and I think that Rothwell for most of the time is going to agree to do that. I think he's going to agree to have basically a striking matchup in the center of the cage. And in that kind of fight, I think Junior is much faster. He has a much sharper jab. He's a much cleaner, smoother combination striker when he gets it off. And if you let Junior find his rhythm and get into his rhythm, it's very difficult to beat Junior in that kind of fight. Recall, Mark Hunt more or less consented to fight Junior in his kind of fight, and Mark Hunt, I think, is a much more technically sound striker than Ben Rothwell is. Like Rothwell is effective, but I think Hunt is more technically sound, and Hunt still struggled. A better version of Hunt still struggled with Junior Dos Santos in that kind of fight.
Rothwell is potentially more powerful than Hunt, in kind of an effortless way. The thing with Ben Rothwell is that he seems to have found a style that really suits his size and his frame. He gets into the pocket, he pulls his head back, and he waits for you to throw something, and then he just drops an easy short punch on you. And I think it's evidence of how hard he hits that he has finally learned that he doesn't have to waste energy on these big, inefficient winging punches. All he has to do is run you into something small, and it hurts you. He's had great success doing that in most of his recent fights. Matt Mitrione realized pretty quickly he didn't want anything to do with Rothwell on the feet once he ate a few. Alistair Overeem took a short right behind the ear and went down. Brandon Vera, similar, and got beaten up in the clinch. And Josh Barnett went for a takedown because he didn't like what was happening in the clinch and with those short punches either. Now, the one thing I think that's a great counter to that for Rothwell, and it's definitely a valid point, especially, by the way, if Junior Dos Santos invests in the body early. If he goes hard on the body for the first 2 rounds, I think his chances dramatically improve. Because I don't think Rothwell will struggle cardio-wise. I think he was sick in the Gabriel Gonzaga fight, and he was fighting in Denver in the Mark Hunt fight. But typically, I think if he fights at his pace, he's pretty good at doing it for a long time.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that you just made about Rothwell and the short punches. It feels like a lot of the time Rothwell's throwing more like half punches.
Yeah. Right.
And this allows him, it makes him faster, first of all. It allows him to get 2 or 3 shots off at a time. It allows him to follow kicks with punches and punches with kicks to the extent that it ups his volume dramatically. Rothwell went from a guy who used to throw 8 or 10 strikes a minute to a lot of the time now he throws 15, even 20. But he does that because he's much more efficient with his energy. And when he's got that weird kind of arms extended stance, it does a couple of things. I'd say it does 3 different things. First of all, it makes him surprisingly hard to hit cleanly. That he does a lot of work in kind of parrying and hand trapping and blocking. Second, it sets up his counters. He's a really good counter fighter. And 3, it makes it hard to see where his punches are coming from.
Yeah,
like that shot that put Overeem down. I don't think Overeem ever saw that coming. You know?
No. And likewise, I think he had some uppercuts on Josh Barnett. I think he's Rothwell he employs what I've heard other people call lots of hand traffic. So at the very least, you got to work to get a punch around to his head, especially with his height and that awkward leaned back stance that he likes to fight out of now. There's a lot of traffic in the way of your punches, so you have to expend some energy, some effort, and some thought more than you usually would. And it's difficult to get good straight punches home. You got to try and find routes around his hands to get to his head. And when he's leaned back like that, it's hard to get a right hand onto him. You know, it's hard to get a good overhand right onto his temple.
So if I'm going to get back to arguing my case for Junior Dos Santos, what would be the worst case scenario for a guy who wants to do those things?
Who wants to do what things?
How would you go about countering a guy who wants to do weird things with his arms outstretched? What would be kryptonite for that kind of style?
You'd blast him to the body over and over again.
You would blast him to the body over and over again. Yeah. Junior Dos Santos is pretty good at that.
He's
and
a good
alternatively,
body puncher.
What else do you want to do? You want to have an advantage in hand speed where you can just blast straight past that kind of outstretched
body. Sure, yeah.
And like Junior Dos Santos has a substantial advantage in hand speed in this matchup.
Yeah, absolutely. And Josh Barnett did the same with his good jabs. He ran Barnett into those jabs. The thing that worries me for Junior's sake in this is how well Rothwell adjusted between the first and second rounds of that Barnett fight. I know he's tough enough to take Junior's jabs for a round. I know he can do that. If it takes him that round to discover that he needs to up the pressure, increase the volume of kicks, and start getting his own jab out there to force Barnett to hesitate, then I think he's tough enough to do that. And he did do that against Barnett. It took him a round to adjust, but he came out more aggressive, more volume, especially from the left hand, hooking and jabbing with that left and setting the right up off of that, and throwing kicks to Barnett's legs. I think if he does those things, then he is going to get Junior into the fence. And once he gets Junior into the fence, if he can keep him there, or if he can even just land those short punches because Junior's ring craft is horribly inefficient. We can both acknowledge this, right? His footwork for moving he does nothing but moving straight back and sidestepping. He practically does not know how to pivot. He does not know how to move into the center of the cage, because he's always trying, when Junior's mind gets to escaping, he's trying to get as far away from his opponent as possible rather than moving into them and getting around them in an efficient and defensively savvy way.
Yeah, so would you agree, though, when we got into the second round of the Overeem fight, and in the Miocic fight to some extent, Junior's footwork looked better?
I don't recall that, but I will. Can you describe to me why you think it looked better? In what way?
Yeah, so I thought he did a much better job in the second round of that fight of backing Overeem up to the fence, of finding his moments to pressure, and he did in spurts. He did a good job of that with Stipe Miocic. So I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a second. We're assuming that Rothwell is going to want to be the guy moving forward. Why do we assume that he's going to be the one who wins that pressure battle? And what do we think about Rothwell's footwork moving backwards? We know that Rothwell can pressure, and he does so in a weird combination of stance switching and standing square to his opponent. It's a really weird kind of thing that he does, but it's effective. What do we do, or how do we think the fight changes if Junior comes out aggressive and wants to be the one pushing Rothwell back?
I think that is Junior's best hope. I think if Junior can consistently push Rothwell backwards, because Junior he's a completely different fighter depending on which direction he's going. He has such a glaring weakness in terms of defensive footwork and cagecraft that you would never know, because we didn't know these things about Junior until he fought Cain Velasquez the second time. They didn't seem obvious to us. You know what I mean? Because nobody else was good enough as striker or pressure fighter to push him backwards. And so we had him striking at range with all of these slower, less savvy fighters, and he looked amazing. As an offensive fighter, Junior is a dynamo. He has great hand speed. He's got more than enough power to send a message, if not to badly hurt you. He's fast. He's quick on his feet. He moves lightly. So I think if he can get Rothwell moving backwards, absolutely. I'm just not confident that he can do that for more than a round. I think we can give Junior credit for making adjustments, but based on what we've seen from these guys recently, I think Rothwell deserves more credit for making intelligent adjustments mid-fight than Junior does. I think Junior has too much confidence and too much heart for his own good, where I don't think he ever feels that he needs... Perhaps we could say that Junior is a supremely tactical fighter, right? He is very, very focused on how to find the openings in whatever exchange you put him in. Our friend of the show, at Naked Gambler, the Naked Gambler on Twitter, he basically said to me the other week, he said that Junior's preferred range is whatever range he can hit you at. And I think that's a very good way of explaining the mentality of Junior Dos Santos, that he doesn't realize that there are areas where he is strongest and where he isn't. He thinks that if he has an opportunity to hit you and if he feels himself connecting, he's going to accept that range. And I don't know that Rothwell will do the same.
Yeah, that's a good point. So you think that if the fight, that past the first round, that Junior comes out hot, probably takes the first. We get into the second round, though. Okay, let's say Junior is a pretty durable guy himself. Do you think it's a given that Rothwell can finish him in that round? And once we get into the third round, if the fight is taking place at a pretty quick pace, which has been Junior's hallmark in the past, we have never seen Junior Dos Santos get tired. If we get into the third round and the fourth round, if Rothwell can't finish him, do you think Rothwell can keep up with the pace that Junior is going to want to set?
I think it's going to be more Rothwell setting the pace than Junior. I think just because of cage generalship, ring generalship, however you want to say it, cage control, cage craft. I think we're going to see Rothwell. The thing is if this was the junior that fought Kane the first time, I would basically think that his heart would be enough to carry him through whatever tough spots. But I think he has suffered a lot of damage since then. Since the first round of that second Cain Velasquez fight. We had both of those fights, 5 rounds of absolutely brutal punishment. He was just recently almost knocked out cold for the first time in his career by Alistair Overeem. And he was knocked down or staggered in the... which fight was that? The Stipe Miocic fight. He's basically been knocked down or knocked out in 4 of his last 5 fights. And that is what worries me. I think that, Junior Dos Santos, but we have seen him get tired, by the way, definitely in the Velasquez fights. Granted, Rothwell's not going to push that kind of pace. Nobody really pushes that Cain Velasquez pace. But I'm just not confident that Junior can get into lots of exchanges like he did with Stipe Miocic against a bigger and more powerful opponent. And I am pretty confident that Rothwell hits harder than Stipe Miocic.
Yeah, there's no question about that. I don't know. So I think we've both kind of made our cases here.
Everyone listening can surely see why it's really difficult to make a pick here.
Yeah, I mean, I think I am more confident in my junior pick than I was when we started talking.
Okay.
I'll be honest. I think for me, I see a couple of distinct advantages. I see an inconsistent pressure game from Rothwell. Mm-hmm. I think that the edges and hand speed, I would say probably shot-for-shot power, potentially volume, but definitely cardio for Junior, and not having to worry about the threat of being taken down in any meaningful way from Rothwell. I don't know. I think that if Rothwell consents to give him a striking matchup, and I think Rothwell probably will, I think more often than not that's going to be a striking matchup in the middle of the cage without Rothwell pushing him backwards. Under those circumstances, I favor Junior in that kind of fight. That would be my summation of my case here.
Yeah, and I don't want to give Rothwell too much credit and say that he's going to fight. Like, I don't want to make it sound like I think he has to fight the perfect fight. I think a lot of my pick here comes down to intangibles. I think Rothwell's confidence is soaring. I think you and I both agree that chin, durability, the ability to recover, those obviously have a lot to do with just natural physical gifts and conditioning, but I think we both agree that confidence plays a huge role in your ability to either absorb or recover from being badly hurt. And I think we have Ben Rothwell, whose confidence is at an all-time high. No doubt it's higher than it has ever been in his career. And we have Junior Dos Santos, whose confidence is almost certainly at an all-time low, having come off the toughest run he's ever experienced after just running roughshod through the heavyweight division for the beginning of his career. And so we basically have a guy who's fallen from a great height against a guy who sees that great height right within his reach. And I think that plays a massive role. And I think we're right on the cusp of seeing Junior Dos Santos hit that James Tahuna territory where his chin starts to seriously not be there for him anymore, even when he expects it to be. So I think the intangibles here, the confidence, the durability, the power, those things play a big part in my decision, and I think Ben Rothwell has the edge in all of those areas. So, yeah, it's a tough as hell fight to call. I'm really interested in it. It is like it's one of those great dramatic narrative kind of fights. It's a real crossroads matchup.
Yeah, I'm really, really interested in this fight. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too, absolutely. So why don't we take a quick break? When we come back, we're going to talk about the 2 other most compelling fights on this card, because the rest of this main card is really hit or miss. But down on the Fox Sports 1 prelims, we have Nicolas Dolby against Zack Cummings, and Mairbek Taisumov versus Damir Hadzovic. Both of those gentlemen will be both of those matchups, all 4 of those gentlemen, after this break. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are 1 or 2 of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. We're going to do a fairly quick discussion of both of these matchups and then do a couple of questions from you, our listeners. Just a reminder, if you pledge $5 to Heavy Hands on Patreon, then you can have a question guaranteed answered on the show. though we still do occasionally. Look for Twitter and other places, so don't hesitate to ask us questions if you can't afford to support us. We will still do our best to entertain the ones that entertain us. First up, we have Nicolas Dolby versus Zack Cummings at welterweight. Nicolas Dolby, a Danish fighter out of Rumble MMA. Where does Zack Cummings train out of?
I am not sure. Let's look this up.
Glory MMA and Fitness. Place that I don't know anything about.
Huh. What do you know?
What do you mean?
Oh, so he trains with guys like James Krause.
Oh, okay.
Okay,
right.
that makes sense.
So
he's a Midwest guy.
You can kind of see James Krause being the Luke Rockhold to Zack Cummings.
You can, yeah, that's interesting. A homeless man's version. I say that with love. I'm actually a huge James Krause fan.
Yeah, but he is a weird fighter. So, this matchup, you are very firmly in the Dolby camp here, Pat.
I am very firmly in the Dolby camp. Yeah,
Why
I think that this is a really, really bad matchup for Zack Cummings.
I'm not so sure, but why do you think Dolby has such a strong chance here?
Mostly because I think that his volume-based approach at range is going to be really hard for a guy who struggles to keep up a consistent pace on the feet, who struggles to close distance against kind of crafty in and out fighters. The basic dynamic I see in this fight is that Cummings is not a defined pressure fighter. He can be aggressive in bursts, but he's not like, it isn't his natural tendency to always be the one moving forward and moving forward and moving forward.
He is kind of a boxer puncher type as well.
Yeah, so in that kind of dynamic, I don't think it's going to be that hard for Dolby to get in and out, get in and out on angles, kick Cummings' legs and body, and wear him down. Like Cummings, I think, is going to have to get this into the clinch and keep it in the clinch, and that's a tall order against a guy like Dolby, who is really, really good at dictating when and how you get into the clinch.
Yeah.
Like Dolby has some of the best clinch entries. Is not some of the best in the sport, but he is extremely good at clinch entries. When you get into the clinch, it's going to be on his terms and not the opponent's.
Yeah, and for not being a particularly technical wrestler in long exchanges and sequences, he is, like Alexander Gustafsson, very good at finding the right time to enter into takedowns. His reactive doubles, like Gustafsson's, they're built off of that sense of timing and sense of range that he has built up as a kickboxer and from his karate background, and that makes him a dangerous wrestler, despite the fact that, like, if you put him in a wrestling room with a lot of the guys he's fought, he would probably get out-wrestled, because he controls when the wrestling happens.
Yeah, exactly so. And that, I think, more than what he actually does, is the real strength of Dolby's game.
Yeah.
But he's got great cardio. He's fought 25-minute fights before and kept up good paces into the fifth round, into the fourth and fifth rounds of those fights. Whereas Cummings has historically been a pretty low output fighter, especially by comparison.
Yeah. Now, you probably talked me into picking Dolby earlier, but I do think there are a couple wrinkles here that make Cummings a more difficult matchup than I think you've given him credit for. First of all, I think Cummings is very, very durable. He's probably one of the more durable fighters in the welterweight division. I think that we've seen in the past, almost every time that Zack Cummings discovers that he can take his opponent's punches, and I don't really have any doubt that he can take a round of Nicolas Dolby's punches, he develops a better idea for where his strengths in the matchup lie and focuses in on applying those strengths as best as he can. It happened in the fight with Gunnar Nelson. It happened in the fight with Jan Cabral. When we have Zack Cummings realizing that he needs to close the distance, he will start to find more ways to do it. When we have Zack Cummings finding that he needs to counterpunch, he will find the right punches and angles to throw and from which to throw. So I think that durability and that fight IQ, that adaptability, give him an edge here. We've also got size and strength from Cummings. So really what I see in this matchup is basically, if Cummings is stuck at range, if Dolby is consistently out-angling him and consistently kicking him, then and not getting taken down off of those kicks, then it's Dolby's fight to lose. And if Dolby is consistently going into the clinch even after he discovers that it doesn't suit him, and I think Dolby's that kind of fighter, he sets his pace and he goes. You know what I mean? Like a Cain Velasquez, a Michael Bisping. He's maybe not even as adaptable as a Michael Bisping. He's very good at what he does, but that is the thing he does. And so we have Dolby fighting his intelligent but sort of static approach and constantly throwing himself into the clinch, into these takedown opportunities for Cummings, he might end up in Cummings' real wheelhouse, which is his top position grappling. So you've probably talked me into picking Dolby here. I think he probably can fight that rangy game, but being a fighter who winds up in the clinch so frequently and against a guy who has been deceptively adaptable in the past in Zack Cummings, I do have questions about it. I do have questions. And I want to point out, Pat, last time you were absolutely this dead certain about a matchup, it was Neil Magny versus Hector Lombard. And it wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, I stick to my guns on that, and I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
Because I think pace is the single most underrated factor, overlooked factor when we're looking at fights.
Sure. Yeah. But pace, the thing with Dolby, though, the thing that worries me about Dolby as a UFC fighter, because I do agree with you, pace is very important. The thing with Dolby is that he needs pace. He absolutely needs it. He's not had an easy UFC fight yet, because each time it has taken a while for that pace to take effect, because he doesn't have the pop in his punches or kicks. He can time a beautiful one. He has that Rashid Magomedov quality where when he hits you clean, it's going to hurt you. But he's not quite that accurate, not quite that well-timed, relies more on volume, more on pace. So, what happens if Nicolas Dolby gets hurt in that first round or the first half of the second round before he wears you down? And I think Zack Cummings is a sneakily hard puncher. I think he's very big and very strong for this division. He used to fight as a light heavyweight. Granted, he was a little chubby then, but he's a big guy. And if he gets you down, I think he can definitely work Dolby on the ground from top position.
Yeah, but so I'm gonna make one more point, and then I think we can wrap this up. And it pertains to pace. Because Cummings is so big for the division and has had so much trouble making the weight in the past, I think that Dolby's cardio becomes doubly effective. So we've seen Cummings go. We saw Cummings go late into the Cabral fight, right? That was a 3-round decision, but that was a really slow paced fight with a lot of grappling. That was more or less the kind of fight that Cummings wanted. If it's not the kind of fight that Cummings wants, if he's being forced to dive forward into the clinch against a guy who's just out of range, if he's being forced to shoot takedowns from too far away, that kind of stuff is going to exhaust a guy who definitely doesn't have Dolby's reserves, but who might not have even average cardio for the division if forced into an average paced fight.
Sure, I haven't seen him look tired, but the pace is definitely could be a factor. It could end up looking a lot like Hendricks versus Wonderboy, but in a lower level of skill from both fighters.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, so I'm with you. I think I'm going to pick Dolby too. I do think it's a difficult one. I mean, I ended up picking Magny in the Lombard fight too, but I did feel pretty good about being afraid of Lombard before the matchup. So we'll see which one of us is not vilified. Vindicated here. One of us will be vilified, one of us vindicated.
We both deserve to be vilified, but that's kind of a separate issue.
The other matchup we want to discuss before we get to questions, we'll do this real quickly. Mairbek Taisumov versus Damir Hadzovic. I'm very excited to see Hadzovic in the UFC. Another example of questionable UFC matchmaking. Why do you take a 29-year-old top prospect who has a lot of potential so Mairbek Taisumov, I think, has moved past the point of having to beat up prospects. And Damir Hadzovic has not gotten to the point where he should be fighting veterans who are on the most violent tear of their entire career. I just don't understand. Mairbek Taisumov, I think, is in terrific form right now. I think he's operating at his absolute peak.
Yeah, Taisumov is a really, really good fighter. He's got 30 fights under his belt. Hadzovic has 12. But Hadzovic is a really, really talented young fighter. If you look at his record, his only losses are to Krzysztof Jotko, who's a UFC middleweight, a big UFC middleweight,
and another middleweight in Andreas Stahl.
Yeah, well, Stahl's fought at welterweight too, hasn't he? I think Stahl's now a welterweight.
He's big,
but he's a really big one.
He's big, and that was also fairly early. And most of Hadzovic's wins are really solid as far as regional Euro circuit wins go.
Yeah, he beat UFC veteran John McGuire. He beat Ivan Musardo, who's kind of a super journeyman on the European scene, a really good journeyman fighter.
Yep.
Martin Delaney, who's solid in Cage Warriors. He has really good wins on his record.
Mm-hmm.
As a fighter, Hadzovic is a lot like Dolby, but a little more violent.
He's like Dolby if you kind of gave him the mindset of a Thomas Almeida.
Yeah, mm-hmm.
He's Dolby who wants to tear through you rather than pick you apart.
Yeah, and where Dolby uses the clinch a lot as a safety blanket after he kind of gets inside. Hodzovic is a murderer there.
Yeah,
he's got a great double collar tie. He's got nice elbows, really powerful short punches. Hodzovic is a violent fighter in those phases. But like you pointed out, Taisimov is at his peak right now. What do you see from Taisimov as a fighter? What makes you think that he can compete with the higher echelons of that division?
Well, I'll say one more thing about Hodzovic before I forget. The thing I really like about Hodzovic, he's a good boxer. He has boxed in the past. He keeps a nice tight guard. He moves well. He throws good combinations. He has really good timing. But the best thing about him is kind of like Holly Holm, is how willing he is to not just rely on his hands. Because Hodzovic is very good when he gets you to duck or flinch, and he will throw up the quickest, most murderous short knees you've ever seen. Much in like a Kyokushin karate kind of style, how he's just willing to just lift that knee up as your chin comes down. It makes him really dangerous in these flashes of clinch, where he's not even really getting into a lot of prolonged clinch exchanges all the time. He's just making you get into clinch range while lowering your elevation, and then just knocks you out. He's scary. But Mirbek Taisimov is to me, he's the outfighter version of Einstein Tumenov. Do you know what I mean? He has that fantastic ability to make adjustments on the fly, whatever phase, whatever range, whatever elevation. Following his first attack, his combinations adjust beautifully for the position of his target. And his movement and his defense as well. He just has more of a kick-heavy game and prefers to fight on the back foot and counter, but he has that same ability to rapidly shift from wrestling to clinch to striking, different kinds of strikings. He's a fantastic transitional fighter. Like right when you think you're stepping out of range, a head kick comes up and knocks you out. Right when you think you're too low, it's an uppercut or a knee or a kick coming up. Right when you think you're about to land your punch, you're running into a counter right, and then he's off to your side. He's very good in those tiny little slivers of time between distances.
I think a lot of that comes down to him being just an extraordinary physical specimen.
Yeah.
He is a crazy, crazy good athlete, super fast, hits really hard, has great understanding of space and distance, like really great hand-eye coordination. He's got all the kind of tangible aspects of athleticism, but he's got all the intangible ones too, in ways that I don't think we've yet fully appreciated.
Yeah.
But what's really obvious is how hard he hits.
Yes.
God, he is a brutal striker, especially with his kicks. I mean, he's got power in his hands too. But when you put all of those physical characteristics together, it makes him a really devastating counterpuncher. I think that's actually the best facet of his game.
Yeah. And then how he flows off of those counters too.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. His ability to lift up a head kick at exactly the right range is exactly the same skill set that gives him a really nasty counter right hand and counter uppercut.
Yep.
He's a supremely talented physical specimen, and I think he's just now starting to put it all together in terms of his skill sets.
I wouldn't be absolutely shocked if Hodzovic beat him, but I think it's too risky of a matchup at this point. And I don't think Hodzovic is probably going to be that deterred. He seems like a very confident fighter. He's had a few tough losses against opponents that were too good for him at that point in his career before. But I just don't understand this kind of matchmaking. Like, the UFC really, really believes this notion that you just throw prospects in against the toughest fighters possible, and the ones that are good enough will survive. But it takes a little bit of nurturing sometimes. You're not going to get the best bonsai tree if you just, throw it outside and you just cruelly snip off all the branches you don't like. Sometimes the tree is going to die.
Yeah, well, I mean, fights like this are the equivalent of trimming a bonsai tree with a chainsaw.
Exactly. Taisimov is a scary guy, a scary kind of veteran to put a prospect against.
Yeah, I mean, honest to God, look at it, there are guys who are in the top 15 right now that I think Mirbek Taisimov would beat.
Sure.
I think that, I think him versus Michael Chiesa would be an even money fight, and I think I would probably pick Taisimov in that.
Sure.
As much as I like a fighter like Michael Chiesa. But there are a lot of dudes like that who are in the upper echelons of the division that Taisimov could, if not beat, then at least give a really tough fight to. I think he's a tough matchup for somebody like Benny Dariush.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, because, lightweight is that kind of division. It's such a deep division. The gap between the truly elite and the ones that you think of are just journeymen is not that large. Like, really, the gap between Rafael dos Anjos and a guy like Taisimov is not as big as it would be in other divisions. It's not Fabricio Verdum to Timothy Johnson. It's not Demetrius Johnson to even a guy like Ray Borg. It's much slimmer than in most divisions because it's so deep. Taisimov is that kind of fighter where he could definitely contend with a lot of guys in the top 10.
Yeah, and he's just now coming into his prime. This is about as good a version of Mirbek Taisimov as we'll see. Yeah. So should we hop into the questions?
Yeah, definitely. I'm glad to have Hadzovic in the UFC. I want to see him perform. I hope he recovers well from what I expect to be probably a pretty tough loss.
Yeah, I don't know that Hadzovic is like a future champion type of fighter, but he's going to be a really fun action fighter on European cards.
Yeah, and I think he'll be solid and consistent if he recovers all right from this defeat. If he wins, all credit to him. By the way, it's not a foregone conclusion. It's just a matchup that has a lot of risk. So with that, let's move on. We got a couple questions from our listeners. Sound effect coming up. Our first question today comes to us via... Which one do we want to talk about? Oh, let's relate this to our discussion of Zack Cummings and Nicolas Dolby, as well as Rothwell versus Dos Santos. Jake M. at Jake Lee Mum, Leemumm, on Twitter. He asks, how can a slower or less voluminous fighter control the pace of a fight? So a fighter who can't necessarily push a pace, how does he thus control the pace?
I think there are two ways to do it. You do it by controlling the range and by controlling the space of the ring, the space of the ring or the cage.
Yeah.
So if you're the slower paced fighter, you can set a range that's too far for your opponent to put volume on you. Or you can back your opponent up to the cage or the ropes, and thereby by controlling the space that way, you can cut off their volume by forcing them to square their feet, and not feel comfortable throwing combinations.
And to have an easier time predicting which direction they're going to move. It's a lot easier. It's a lot easier to hit a quickly moving target if you can. If you have a limited array of options, if I know you're going to go right or left, it's much easier for me to pick than if I know you're going to go right, left, forward, or back.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you have them backed up, you also have all the space in the world to move yourself.
Right. Yes.
And so you get to be the one picking and choosing when and where you exchange, and so that's to your benefit.
I'll say timing as well. Being able to time the opponent's shots. Timing beats speed, but in a certain sense, I think timing also beats work rate. A fighter who can push the pace. Like, for example, we just had a long discussion that bordered on argumentative for most of it about Nicolas Dolby and Zack Cummings. But we can both agree that when Nicolas Dolby fought Darren Till, the first round of that fight, there was a fairly dramatic shift in work rate and movement from Dolby after he started to eat some of the hard counters from Till. When Till ran him into a few of those good straight shots in that first round, there was a period of adjustment where Dolby had to kind of talk himself back into his usual pace.
Yeah, you can disincentivize your opponent from doing the things they want to do. So you can do that in a couple of different ways. I mean, so counterpunching is the most obvious one, and that's what we saw in that Dolby Till fight.
Yep.
But reactive takedowns or reactive clinch entries are another.
Yeah.
So
anything that makes them unsure. Anything that makes them unsure is going to force more space between the number of strikes or the number of takedowns they shoot for or whatever.
Exactly. If you can do anything to get them off of their preferred game, then that's going to slow the pace down to your. I'm trying to think of a good example for this, or a good example of this. Josh Thompson versus Nate Diaz.
That's a great one. That's a great example.
So Josh Thompson, not a particularly quick-paced fighter, but through constant movement and cutting angles and looking for clinch entries and things of that nature, he was able to slow down Diaz.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a fantastic example. You can slow the work rate. You break their rhythm. You break their confidence. Both of those things have a profound effect. So timing, ring craft, cage generalship, ring generalship, and Yeah, pressure, I guess. It's good to have the initiative at any time. You have the initiative, you don't necessarily need to be the more voluminous fighter, as you said. So thanks for that question, Jake. And our next question before we wrap up here comes to us from Jimmy Clark. We're looking forward to Jones versus OSP. OSP probably won't be on this list, but Jimmy, at Jimmy Clark, asks us, if you had to rank Jon Jones's 3 to 5 best wins based on skill or style, how would you rank them? So which ones are most impressive, but also which ones, as Greg Jackson might say, are the most artistic and beautiful?
So I would say first, I would rank the Cormier win as the best of his career. I think I don't think that Cormier was the most difficult matchup, but I think that Cormier is the best fighter that he's faced. Yeah. And I think the way that Jones took him apart in all of Cormier's preferred phases speaks to how good Jon Jones is. That's my number one. What's your number one, Connor?
I have to agree with you, Daniel Cormier. I think, just the fact that I think Jones also showed the most improvement, the most really tangible improvement in that fight. I thought his boxing was at an all-time high in terms of his timing and the style of his punches, threw a few more combinations, mixed up his shots a lot better, blended it. His clinch game looked better than ever because Daniel Cormier is a far better clinch fighter than Glover Teixeira. And how intelligently he decided the range in that fight was better than ever before. He knew when he needed to be at long range. He knew when it was best to step in and cut Daniel Cormier off coming in. He knew when he needed to move laterally and when he needed to smother. He did a brilliant job of dictating the range of that fight at almost every moment. So even when he wasn't winning, he was at the very least deciding how he was going to lose this exchange. Yeah,
it was... I think one of the smartest performances we've ever seen from a fighter. He was 3 steps ahead of Cormier the entire fight. He was playing chess while Cormier was playing checkers as that fight went on.
Yeah. For next, I'm going to go with the one right before that. I think Glover Teixeira, just for artfulness. There are a few fights that blow me away the same way that Glover Teixeira did. The level of infighting that Jon Jones displayed, the wrist control, the hand fighting inside, the combinations of elbows and punches to head and to body. Once Jon Jones discovered that the clinch is where he really wanted to be in that fight, I thought, as Greg Jackson did say between rounds in that fight, he was putting on an artistic, beautiful performance. I really think it's something to watch.
I'm going to go back a few years and say, for me, the number 2 would be Lyoto Machida. I think that was not a fight that Jones had a ton of time to prepare for. He beat Rampage, and then he was pretty much directly back in camp for that. He didn't get a ton of time for specific training. It's not like he had 6 months to prepare for the puzzle of Lyoto Machida. This was, I would say, one of the last fights of Lyoto Machida's prime. Before he started to slow down, and the first round was the first time we had ever seen Jones in any real trouble, to have to overcome any real adversity. But for the most part, Jon Jones is a process fighter, right? He's a guy who wears you down. He wins by being smarter than you over most of the fight, by picking and choosing his spots. That fight was Jon Jones's killer instinct. He hurt Machida. Got Machida down, busted him up on the ground, hurt him on the feet as there's blood pouring out of Machida's face, grabs the choke, and chokes him unconscious. And all of a sudden, a fight that had been fairly competitive for the first 6 minutes or so, all of a sudden, it was over. The whole fight was over.
In an instant, it became a non-competitive fight. Unlike the Shogun fight where Jones just held on to the momentum, it became a closely contested fight that quickly and suddenly became Jon Jones's fight 100%.
Yeah, and that was the moment, I think, where if you weren't sold on Jon Jones as a dominant champion moving forward, then that was the moment where you became sold, where you realized that this was not just a special talent, a rising star of that sort, where you realized that, oh no, Jon Jones is incredible.
Yeah. And it broke my heart, that Lyoto Machida fight. I don't like to see Lyoto flopping on the ground like that. That's a good pick.
That was ugly.
I think for number 3, and we'll restrict ourselves to top 3 here, I'm going to go with Rashad Evans. I think that Evans was already on the downslide at this point. He was no longer in his prime. But I think this was the first fight where we saw Jones under immense mental pressure. Before the Cormier fight, which had a very similar kind of dynamic between the two fighters, and we already knew how Jones would deal with that, we got to see Jones in the heel position. We got to see the public turning against him. He was booed at the weigh-ins. He came out to a beautifully ironic remix, I think, of Could You Be Loved by Bob Marley. Do you remember that?
I don't, but I won't go over where and how I was watching that fight.
If I recall, it was the first time that he had "The Champ Is Here" as the intro to his walkout song, and then it turned into "Could You Be Loved." And given all of the bad vibes there were going on toward John Jones before that fight, it was such a beautiful choice of walkout, and you just knew in that moment he was so confident in his ability to win. And then he came in there, and I think it was the dawn of Championship Jones, where Jones had come against an opponent who was no doubt very well prepared, an opponent who had, I think Rashad had just begun fighting at the Black Zillions around that time. He hurt Jones a few times early in the fight, and Jones had to go through a bit of an adjustment, and Jones had to kind of learn to fight after the Machida fight in a way that he had to get rid of the expectation that he could blow all of his opponents away. Because now he was a champion. Now he had come into 3 title bouts. Everyone who's going to fight him from this point on would have all of this footage to prepare for, all of these past mistakes to learn from, and he performed beautifully. There was, aside from 1 or 2 punches and a head kick that Rashad landed, there were no instance where Jones, even then, Jones did not seem to be losing hold of the momentum. He was still able to be playful and destructive and cruel and all of these things we love from John Jones in a strategic, composed kind of way. So I'm going to say that's the third most impressive one to me.
For me, I'm going to say the Alexander Gustafsson win for a couple of reasons.
Yeah.
First, just to get this out of the way first, it's nonsense to say that A, that was a robbery, or B, I think even to say that it was a close fight but a win for Gustafsson. John Jones clearly won 3 rounds and probably 4 in that fight, but it's one of the clearest examples of challenger bias out there, where just because one fighter is doing so much better than you think he will, that you tend to overrate that fighter. And
especially given the aura that Jones had gained by that time.
Yeah, I think that it's really easy if you go back and watch that fight now to see, oh yeah, no, this is a really, really clear John Jones win. But leaving that aside, this was clearly not a Jones who had worked his hardest going into that fight. Mm-hmm. It took him a while to get things figured out. It was not a great performance, especially for the first couple of rounds. This was not John Jones at his best. But when you got into the 4th round of a fight that by that point he could have very well lost, he turned it on. He found his moment. He found the perfect moment to land the perfect spinning elbow. It happened to be exactly at the point when Gustafsson had really started to tire, and Jones dominated the last 6.5 minutes of that fight. Yeah. Last 6.5, 7 minutes. And we got to see, oh no, this is even a John Jones who's clearly not at his best, who clearly was not in great shape to start his camp, didn't take this seriously. You got to see just how special he actually is.
Yeah, crazily, it was John Jones beating a very technical boxer with a move that totally represented the unpolished John Jones who had initially come to the UFC's light heavyweight division. It perfectly defines John Jones, because it wasn't John Jones's newly improved boxing or infighting or all of these new little subtle things he's added. It was John Jones turning the tide with a crazy spinning elbow. His special move, he had to charge it up for 3 rounds and tap A rapidly to get it to happen during the cutscene. It was like a special move, and it totally illustrated everything that is great and weird and confounding about John Jones in that moment. So, solid pick. Thank you for the questions, guys. Jimmy Clark, was it who asked that one? I closed Twitter.
Yes, it was. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. My memory is all right. Jimmy Clark and... Oh, God. Someone mum. Who was our first guy? That's okay. Thank you both of you guys for your questions. I shouldn't have even tried to remember it. Should have been satisfied with Jimmy Clark. We appreciate you guys writing in. Remember, you can get a guaranteed question answered on the show if you pledge $5 and play Tier blah, blah, blah. Both Pat and I have our previews coming out this week. Mine on ShareDog.com. Full preview of UFC Zagreb. Pat, you're working on your full breakdown of the card over there on Bleacher Report. Anything else coming out from you this week?
I'm not sure. I was going to do a joint piece on ring rust with my colleague Chad Dundas, but I'm not sure. It depends on if Khabib is still in or not for that. I'm going to UFC Media Day tomorrow, so maybe something will come out of that.
Yeah.
But that's it. That's all I got going.
Yep. I have a piece coming out. Nicolas Dolby is having my man Ivica Truszczyk in his corner. basically Ivica feels that Ivica, by the way, a guy who fights you should definitely YouTube. Not always consistent, not always, almost very rarely actually prepared as best as possible for his matchups. I've scouted for him in the past. I scouted for him on his second to most recent win. He knocked out Victor Halmy to win the FFC welterweight title. But he's really good, and he's a journeyman, like in the best sense, where he is the kind of guy that small promotions, they're built on the backs of guys like Ivica, and he's going to be cornering Nicolas Dolby at UFC Zagreb. He's fought Nicolas twice in the past, once on very short notice after having already been beaten up by him once, and so I basically kind of got his story about how it came about that he's cornering Nicolas, how they went from foes to friends, as it were. So that'll be coming out from me this week, in addition to the preview. Maybe something else. I don't know. It's been difficult to come up with like clear narratives for technical breakdowns over the past couple weeks. So it'll pick back up. We got Jones, we got Khabib. Hopefully, we got a bunch of great matchups coming up in the future. Hopefully, Rothwell versus Dos Santos will be fun to break down after the fact as well. But thank you, everybody, for joining us for today's episode. Look forward to that interview with Brandon Gibson after John Jones versus OSP. Unless OSP knocks John out, in which case I couldn't fault Brandon for not wanting to come back on. But I don't think it'll happen. Thank you otherwise for listening. I hope you enjoyed today's show. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. It's been Heavy Hands.